If everyone could please mute yourself until the Q&A later, that would be great. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks for joining this evening for a conversation with science journalist and author Erica Gies about her award-winning book, Water Always Wins, Thriving in an Age of Drought and Deluge. My name is Jenny Tompkins. I am the PennFuture campaign manager for clean water advocacy. I am based in the Lake Erie watershed, so I might not have had a chance to interact with all of you. I'm happy that you're joining us from near and far this evening. In a few minutes, I will formally introduce Erica and get the conversation started. However, I wanted to discuss a few logistical items first. We've already started recording, so we will share this with all of our registrants and on our social media within the week. And for those who we may have, let me just stop sharing my screen and let a few more folks in. 1 second, everyone. All right, I'm gonna reshare. Thanks for your patience. Okay, so for those that may have just joined, again, I'm hearing the ding. Please feel free to tell us where you're from and what watershed you're joining us from. I want to highlight some expectations for Zoom. This is a Zoom meeting rather than a webinar, which some of you have already heard. That means you have the ability to mute and unmute yourself and decide if you want to share your camera or not. I have asked that you please keep yourself muted until the Q&A. I may mute you if I hear anything coming from your computer. So during the Q&A, you're going to have two options for asking questions of Erica. You can enter a question in the chat, which some of you have been using to introduce yourselves, found at the bottom of the screen. You can also, when called upon, unmute yourself and ask a question. Once I call on you, once you raise your hand, I'll call on you, and then feel free to put your hand down when you're done speaking. So please try your best to ask questions as well. I know it can be tempting to add comments only, but with the inflection of a question. So there are different view options in Zoom as well. I currently have participant view on so I can see everybody rather than just speakers. You can choose to do the same. And I'm gonna just do a warning about being patient with us. Erica and I have separate PowerPoint presentations for ease of switching between slides. So just be patient as we unshare and reshare and flip through those different presentations. Erica had the great idea of providing some visuals for some of the slow water concepts we're going to talk about and the locations that she's traveled and reported on. Some of the great stories that she shared in her book we'll reflect on as well. So I wanted to also share that this event actually kicks off a collaborative stormwater series that PennFuture is partnering with a number of organizations on in the Erie region from now through the end of the summer. I'll provide more details about the upcoming events at the end, but I appreciate being able to start the series off with an inspirational and globally reaching discussion, thanks to Erica and her work. After learning about water detectives and the slow water movement, this event series for Erie will actually introduce Erieites and hopefully visitors, including yourselves, maybe if you're up in Erie, to our local water detectives, which we'll define tonight. Thanks to many of you for joining from outside of the Lake Erie watershed, as we wanted to make sure everyone on our subscriber list had the benefit of hearing about Erica's work. I also want to thank our partners at Press, Books, Coffee, and Gifts in Erie for providing a portion of their sales of Water Always Wins to PennFuture. They still have copies available on the store and online, so we'll cover some more details about that later as well. So to get back to tonight's focus, I wanted to go over a brief outline. We're getting through logistics and an opening here, and then I'll give a formal intro to Erica in just a couple of minutes. Appreciate everybody's patience with the tech and folks joining a little bit late as well. So we'll go through an introduction to Erica, and then we'll actually go through some background questions that I've prepared for her, and she'll go through her slides just so we can do some level setting. Some of us may have read Water Always Wins when it was first published back in 2022, and some of us may have just had a refresher or read it for the first time last week. Either way, we're coming at this through different levels of knowledge and understanding about some of the key terms and concepts we'll discuss. So we'll let Erica give us a bit of a primer. We'll then have a very brief presentation from me about considerations for the slow water movement in Pennsylvania and how we can put some of what Erica shares in context for the clean water advocacy that we all partake in here. We'll then shift to a Q&A where you all can either submit questions in the chat or raise your hand as we discussed. And then we'll close with some upcoming events, the Stormwater Series for Erie, and some other considerations. So with that, I think that considers the logistics. I'm going to stop my screen share and provide a formal introduction for Erica. I want to thank Erica so much for joining us this evening, likely from the West Coast of either Canada or the US, as you'll hear from her bio. I thoroughly enjoyed reading Water Always Wins after seeing an interview with you, Erica, for one of the Great Lakes media sources, Great Lakes Now, and I really appreciate the opportunity to share your work with our members and supporters. So for a bio of Erica that I took in part from her website, Erica Gies is an award-winning independent journalist who writes about water, climate change, plants, and critters for Scientific American, the New York Times, Nature, The Atlantic, The Guardian, National Geographic, and more, which are very impressive. Her stories hail from North America, especially California and British Columbia, and the wider world. In a quest for commonalities that bind us and the innovations that inspire, she has reported from many intriguing places, several of which we're going to talk about that were featured in Water Always Wins, Thriving in an Age of Drought and Deluge. Winner of the Rachel Carson Award for Excellence in Environmental Journalism, Water Always Wins is about what Erica calls slow water innovations that are helping us adapt to the increasing floods and droughts caused by climate change. I have disappeared from frame. So 1 second, everyone. Having a Zoom background is complicated sometimes. I will get that figured out in a minute when I finish this bio. So Erica is a National Geographic explorer as well and lives in Victoria, British Columbia and San Francisco with her partner and her half-wild, half-love bug tabby cat. I love that description. So Erica, thanks again for being with us tonight. I'll give you an opportunity to share your slides. In the meantime, I just wanted to reflect a little bit more on my reading of Water Always Wins. As a professional in this clean water advocacy space and a person who loves travel, your book inspired me and made me feel like I was traveling and learning alongside you. You translate scientific concepts in an approachable way, and by focusing in on the people at the center of these slow water projects, it made the stories that much more memorable. All of that is to say, I think everyone here tonight would connect with the stories you share, reflecting on their own relationship with water. So I'm going to dive into some of those background questions that I mentioned. While Erica's doing a bit of a primer, feel free to add questions to the chat and we'll address those in order in the Q&A. So Erica, to start off, would you please give our audience a brief overview of the slow water movement and describe the water detectives you traveled around the globe to learn more about in Water Always Wins?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here. I'm going to share my screen here. So yeah, the slow water movement is really about changing the culture of how we relate to water. And I think, in the dominant culture, by which I mean the US, Europe, exported around the world, we tend to have kind of a control mindset toward water. If we're worried about and we see it in terms of like a commodity if we don't have enough, or a threat if we're worried about flooding. And what I discovered in traveling around the world is that a lot of people see water differently. They see water as a friend or a relative. And that type of framing encourages systems thinking. So thinking about water's relationship with rock and soil and microbes and beavers and people, plants. And so the water detectives are really people in all kinds of, they are indigenous peoples, they are farmers, urban planners, landscape architects, engineers, ecologists, hydrologists, and they are all people who really approach water with a sense of respect and curiosity. And the question that they're asking is, what does water want? And that question is different than the question we often think of, which is, what do we want? And so in thinking about what does water want, they sort of set themselves up for this slow water approach. So climate change is definitely causing an increase in extreme flooding and drought. that is a scientific fact that has been well documented. But a piece of it that we don't hear so much about is how our development choices have had a really significant impact on the water cycle, and in fact are also making these floods and droughts much worse. So just a few statistics to show the scale of that. We've filled or drained up to 87% of the world's wetlands. We've dammed and diverted 2/3 of the world's large rivers. The land area covered by pavement in our cities has doubled just since 1992. Deforestation is decreasing rainfall locally, regionally, and globally, and conversely also increasing the power of hurricanes and typhoons. And we've really dried out the landscape by killing beavers, levying rivers, overgrazing, and overpumping of groundwater. And so in all of these ways, we've altered the natural water cycle. And so we're actually causing a lot of the flood and drought. And so until we address those land use issues, we're going to continue to have issues with water. So it is climate change, but it's not just climate change. And the slow water approach that people are taking is really trying to return some of this land to slow water processes. So wetlands, floodplains, mountain meadows, and forests, the places that water kind of naturally slows on the land and sinks underground. And many wonderful things happen in that land-water relationship. So this is a global movement. I named it Slow Water, thinking of the slow food movement, which is also unique to each place. So there are some commonalities in the slow water approaches, but every place has unique geology, ecology, and human culture. And so slow water projects work within that. Instead of trying to control water, they respect water's agency and relationships with other natural entities. Instead of that kind of single focus problem solving about worried about flooding, build a levee, they deploy systems thinking. Instead of centralized projects, they are local and distributed across the landscape, which makes sense if you think of that 87% of wetlands that we've eradicated. These projects are socially just. So I think we're familiar with the idea that a levee protects one community, but raises the water level because it's cutting the river off from its floodplain. And so that can increase flood risk on a nearby community who perhaps can't afford a levee. But dams are also an environmental justice issue. A 40-year overview found that they brought water to 20% of the world's population, but decreased water availability to 24% of the world's population. And lastly, slow water projects are community facing. And in some places I went, like Peru and India, people are actively coming together with other people in their communities in a hands-on way to build these slow water projects and to maintain them. In other places, it might be more of an educational component where the experts are still handling it, but there's educational signage in, say, a floodplain that has been returned to a park instead of an industrial site. So people who are interacting with that landscape can understand the role that the land and the water are playing in that area.
Thanks, Eric. I appreciate you giving an overview of the slow water movement and the critical components of that. I really just want to reflect on some language that you use, respect. You use several times in terms of our relationship with water. And I really appreciate the focus and attention you've had on slow water projects being local and being place-based, which gives hope and inspiration, of course, that we all have a role to play, whether or not we're a professional water expert or just a concerned advocate who wants to support those folks in our local communities. So thank you again for the primer. You also talk quite a bit in the book about your own lived experience, not just as a journalist in your adult life, but also your childhood in California. So I wondered if you could give a little bit of an origin story for how the book came to be. And how could you reflect on how those experiences in your life brought you to think that they have to be compiled in this way that's digestible for average people?
Sure, yeah. So these two pictures, I think, are really illustrative of California. They were taken 2 years apart. The one on the right was taken in 2015, and it's the Folsom Reservoir, which is 100 million, no, don't quote me on that. I think it's 1 million acre feet of water. And as you can see, it's nearly empty during the drought in 2015. And then the picture on the left was not far from there in 2017 when we had a lot of atmospheric rivers and there were really big floods. So, California, definitely these trends are getting more extreme with climate change, but this kind of drought flood cycle is typical, and I grew up with that. So in my childhood, we had a big drought and we had assemblies at school on how to conserve water. And I think in general, for Californians, water is sort of a low-key obsession of just about everyone because it is so important and we don't take it for granted. So I already had that kind of background, and I've always cared a lot about nature. My family did a lot of hiking and camping when I was a kid, generally around California. And I sort of had a point of pride of swimming in any body of water we came across, the Pacific Ocean, alpine lakes with ice, big rivers. And so I really identified with water in that way. And I think almost everyone has, a favorite body of water where you have that early experience where you kind of imprint upon water. There's something in us, I think, that really loves water. And so when I became an environmental journalist and I started writing about water, I started realizing that this aspect of how our approaches to water were actually making things worse was not being covered in a significant way. And I felt like it was such an important part of the story. And so that's why I wrote this book to try to draw more attention to the people who are trying to do something about it. Because, this movement is global and it's been around for, well, in some aspects, it's been around for millennia because people have always innovated ways to work with the natural water availability in their area. But in the modern movement, I would say it's 10 plus years old, 15 years old. And but it's growing rapidly, and there's a growing body of science that is showing that these projects work and that they have multiple benefits. But most people don't really know about them, or if they do know about them, they don't understand that they can be a significant part of the solution. And it's really a question of scale, right? Because these are local distributed projects, you need a lot of little ones scattered across the landscape to have an impact. But the reason why the infrastructure that we have had has worked to the extent that it has is because we've had a lot of natural buffer in the system. But with population growth and the expansion of our footprint, we've now damaged 75% of the Earth's land area. And so we just don't have a lot of that buffer left, which is why restoring these natural water ecosystems is so important at this time. And there's a really important climate component too that I've been learning more about in terms of water vapor being a greenhouse gas and the primary way that the planet cools itself. So it's not just that these landscapes store carbon dioxide in wetland soils and in trees. There's also a really important cooling and rain providing component and moderating component to these landscapes that, again, is not getting hardly any attention or funding.
Yeah, thank you, Erica, for reflecting on how we came here and how your experiences built up to the publication of Water Always Wins. I definitely resonated with where you started a bit of the grounding that water has for us and the sense of place that we assign when we have a relationship with water. Some of the stories that you shared about the blending of traditional ecological knowledge and scientific understanding in the book were ones that I was particularly inspired by. Stories where you have water detectives from multiple principles and backgrounds coming together to make a solution possible. So in that vein, I wanted to ask you about specific stories and travels on your journey to the creation of the book. I know that there are probably some specific examples that you want to share with us as an audience to talk about, but also that might resonate with us as Pennsylvanians in a state where we have 86,000 miles of river and streams. So are there specific water detectives and stories you want to reflect on for all of us?
Sure. Yeah, I think, well, I'll just start briefly with Iraq. So I went to the Mesopotamian marshes of Iraq, which are thought to be the biblical Garden of Eden. And here are the Madan people, the marsh dwellers, and they are continuing a way of life that has persisted for 9,000 years. And their culture lives on top of the wetlands, and they really see water as life, as the source of everything that they need. And this woman here, her boat is full of Phragmites australis, which is a fast-growing reed that has become invasive in other places, but it is native to the Mesopotamian marshes, and they build the islands that they live on out of it. They build their homes, their livestock, uh, you know, paddocks, and it's a source of food. And I feel like their approach to water, um, it shows that, draining wetlands, filling them in, building on top of that is not innately human. These are people who have found a way to live with water in a really beautiful way. They raise water buffalo for milk and cheese. They construct these islands out of the reeds, and they're sort of bouncy, like a bounce house when you walk on them. Um, and they get around in these boats. This is their traditional home. Um, and, you know, during the 9,000 years that they've been here, many irrigated civilizations have risen and fallen around them. But whenever they would fall, the water would retake the marshes, and the Madan would just continue their way of life. And here is a really beautiful community center, which again is built entirely of Phragmites australis. And now their way of life is threatened by upstream dams in Turkey and Iran that are diverting a lot of the water that would otherwise support the marshes. But I do think that there's something to be learned from them in the way that they really seek to work with water systems. If I could talk about another thing that might be a little more recognizable for North American audiences, our friend the beaver, which has become kind of famous in recent years. There have been a number of books about the beaver, and in the Western US, many states are changing their policies to, instead of try to eradicate beavers because they're worried about flooding, they're encouraging beavers return. And people probably know that there were perhaps 60 to 400 million beavers across North America at the time of European settlement. The trappers who came ahead of the settlers killed many of them. And it's estimated that the current population is perhaps 1/10 of what there was historically. And so killing all these beavers really dramatically changed the North American landscape. It was a much wetter place. It's estimated that 1/10 of the continent were beaver-created wetlands that were incredible for biodiverse habitat. More than 200 plants and animals use beaver wetlands. But also the groundwater table was really, really healthy because the beavers slow water and allow it to infiltrate underground. And so let me talk first about the UK briefly, because the UK, well, Europe also has a species of beaver, which is quite similar to the North American beaver. And from the UK, it was completely eradicated 400 years ago. And in the last decade or two, people have been, it was illegal to have beavers because there was a fear of flooding. but people did guerrilla beavering, releasing beavers illegally back into streams where they were once native so that they would build their dams and slow the water. And what's really interesting is like people tend to think that beavers cause floods, but in fact, in England, people are interested in them because they reduce floods. And that's because a lot of towns are built really close to the river. And when you have bigger rainstorms, so climate change, the river can't hold it. And it's not just climate change, it's also that the urban footprint has expanded. So you have more water running off all at once. But beavers dams, the water still goes downstream, but over a longer period of time because it takes a while to move through the dam. And so what that does is it reduces the flood peak. The water doesn't get as high. So that's a really interesting reason to have the beavers come back. And then in the Western US, I love this drawing because Idaho and California actually did parachute beavers into the backcountry in the mid 20th century. These days, they are generally delivered by truck. But there's been a long understanding that beavers help to repair water systems, and particularly in the West, where we have relied upon snowpack to provide some of our summer water because we don't get rain in the summer. And the snowpack is melting because of climate change. The return of beavers can hold water on the landscape in a similar way. So one researcher found that beavers in this area, the first year, they stored 75 times more water above and below ground per 100 meters of stream. And in some watersheds, that could increase summer water availability by 20%. And there's also a really important fire suppression component because it's not just that beaver ponds don't burn, but also that they're raising the water table across a wider area. And so plants have access to that water and are a lot less flammable. So I have other examples, but maybe I'll stop there and wait for your next question, Jenny.
Those are both great, Erica, and I found myself chuckling out loud when I read the chapter on gorilla beavering in the UK. I've traveled in the UK, and I wish that I'd had an opportunity to visit some of the beavers that they've been rewilding in some of the headwater areas you discussed. But at PennFuture, we have some running jokes on the water team about what would beavers do in certain situations, and kind of thinking of them as models, role models as well. And the other thing is just I wanted to reference in Pennsylvania, we do not have an appreciation, of course, for Phragmites, a common reed species. It is particularly destructive to wetlands in the Lake Erie watershed and beyond. So to be able to read about it in its native range and the people who've relied on it for thousands of years, I found a newfound appreciation thanks to you. It definitely inspired me to think more critically about the role that it plays in Europe and the Middle East. So with that, I wanted to just reflect on a couple of your stories too that were particularly impactful for me and some of the water detectives. When I was a high school environmental science student, I read Wangari Maathai's memoir Unbowed for the first time in my formative years as a budding environmental scientist. And to hear about the folks who kind of continued that movement forward, the Greenbelt movement in the Central Highlands of Kenya, protecting water towers and essential groundwater resources, that was incredible to read about. I'm so happy that you covered some of that. And I also wanted to just say that you opened your book with the discussion of hidden rivers and hidden creeks. And there's actually a budding project in Erie to kind of restore a relationship with one of our key hidden rivers or creeks. So just from the beginning, Erie's, I'm resonating with this right away. There's a direct connection. So anyway, moving on to another question before I give too much away of my reflections. Water Always Wins was published in 2022, and you did a lot of your research actually at the height of the pandemic. As we know, our world has changed quite a bit since spring of 2020. Are there any recent developments in the slow water movement that you want to reflect on and share with us? And just before I give it over to you, it's worth mentioning that the US, our context has changed a lot with the Biden administration and some of the critical federal investments that we've seen, some key announcements in the water space, even this Earth Week. So we know in the US, we're having slightly different conditions maybe than some of the stories that you had featured. So I'll give it back to you.
Okay, yeah, tough choices of what to talk about. I guess You mentioned urban streams, so maybe I'll just very briefly talk about a story that was in the book, which is about a stream restoration project in Seattle. So many streams are buried in urban areas around the world. And that's where the hidden stream movement comes from. People want to understand what streams were doing historically, because that's a good sense of where water may go again. And in fact, if I can pop back to this, this is South Seattle, the Duwamish River in the mid 1800s and today. And so the straightening of the river, the corralling of it into a tight channel, and then building up to the edge of it, that's really common where streams remain on the surface. And that can cause a lot of flooding because the water doesn't really have space to do its natural thing. And it's really sick. And I could go into this in some detail, but I don't know if we have time for that. But I just want to draw people's attention to the fact that the stream is not just what you see here. There's another zone, and it's not just the groundwater. It's called the hyporeic zone, and it's an ecotone in between the surface water and the groundwater. And water's moving down through it and up through it, but also downstream, but orders of magnitude more slowly than what's on the surface because it's moving through the soil and rock. And inside this hyporeic zone, there are microbes, crustaceans, worms, aquatic insects, and they play a really pivotal role in the nitrogen, phosphorus, and carbon cycles. And it's very much like the stream's gut microbiome. And so if you don't have that, if that's unhealthy, if it's been scoured away by the kind of fast water that urban streams create, your stream has very little hope of being healthy. And the hyporeic zone can extend about 30 feet from either side of a stream bank, or on a large river, actually a mile from the banks. So the river itself is much bigger than that little channel that we see. And that's really important to keep in mind, and the function of the hyporeic zone if you're thinking about a restoration project. Because without it, you're just going to have to continue to maintain it again and again. And this project in Seattle to restore the missing hyporeic zone was the first in the world, as far as I know, in an urban stream. And the hyporeic zone had been all scoured away. They had to rebuild it. They had to inoculate it with the little critters from a wilder stream. And then they did a bunch of scientific studies to see how it had worked. And one of the studies, they were trying to find out if more critters would return, because an urban stream is typically kind of a crows and cockroaches situation where the life that you have is not very biodiverse. And they did find that the restored sections had 7 times more crustaceans, worms, and insects, and much greater species biodiversity. And they also did a test of the pollution. So when you have a big rainstorm and you have all that rain running off the pavement really quickly and dumping into the stream, they measured the pollutants and they found more than 1,900. And this is all unregulated, right? Because it's not coming from a factory or whatever, it's non-point source pollution. So these are things like lawn fertilizer, brake pad dust. And they found that spending 3 hours in a 15-foot stretch of the hyporeic zone reduced 78% of the chemicals by at least half. So this can be a really important feature in helping to clean up our water systems. And I know that Pennsylvania has some talk about restoring riparian zones, like replanting the forests alongside streams. And that's really important, but hopefully wider than just the streams. And there are other things that you can do within your urban landscape to reduce that pollution, to reduce that runoff, to reduce flooding. This picture on the left is my yard in San Francisco, which I began restoring to native plants about 20 years ago. And this picture on the right is in Vancouver, and it's a bioswale, which is an attempt to help rainwater infiltrate and also capture water that's running off the street in the urban pavement and filter it through these plants. And I know that Philadelphia has been a real leader in green infrastructure projects. In 10 years, it's built about 800 projects, keeping 2.7 million gallons of polluted water out of rivers annually. And this project is set to continue through 2035. And this goes by other names around the world, like sponge cities in China. Here's a couple of pictures. This is a big city in China with a major sponge cities project in the middle. And then here's what it looks like in flood. So the idea is, again, to give water space. You had asked about what has happened since. One thing I'm been learning a lot about since writing the book, and I have written some articles about, and I think may write another book about, is the role of forests in the water cycle. So I did write about that in chapter 8, the Kenya chapter, because they are restoring highland forests for their role in the water cycle. But there's a really interesting body of science which is showing how important healthy, intact forests are to the water cycles. So, a lot of our logging, clear cuts, and then replants, basically plantations of one or two target species. And they may look like forests to an unpracticed eye, but in fact, they are not able to regulate the water cycle and the climate stability in the way that healthy, intact forests can. So, tree roots help water move underground. Trees create rain because they pull that water up from the ground and release the vapor into the air, and that's what creates rain. And in the past, people thought that the vast majority of rain came from evaporation over the oceans. But more recently, people have found that about 40% of average of rain over continents comes from forests and plants. And in the eastern US, it's something like 70 or 80%. So it's really, really huge. And these plants generate rain on many cycles, like locally, the water goes up, it comes down nearby regionally, and then also on the other side of the planet, because the vapor moves into these big jet streams. And so deforestation can actually cause drought on the other side of the planet. And we see this like with the Amazon and the US. We see this with the Congo in Europe. And maintaining healthy ecosystems. And that's not to say that we should plant forests and grasslands. Grasslands are their own important ecosystem that also provide water. So there are other things people are learning about. So that's just all to say that, when you talk about nature-based solutions, a lot of the mainstream talk you get is about carbon storage. And so it's like, let's plant trees, let's plant a bunch of pine trees because they grow really fast and we can store a bunch of carbon quickly. But in fact, those projects typically are not looking at all at the tree's role in the water cycle. And if you're planting plants that don't belong in a place, they're likely to harm the water cycle and not help it. There's a lot more to the science of how trees regulate the water cycle and the climate cycle. And there's this idea of the reason we're having fires is because the forests are laden with fuel and we need to remove the fuel. And there's a little bit of truth to that, but more recent studies have found that intact forests burn at a lot less severe rates. And it's because they're holding the water in the soils, they're holding the water in the understory plants. And so that water cycle piece again is missing. So I just want to encourage people to think about water when you're thinking about various types of landscape restoration. And the takeaway message from all of the water detectives that I met in all the slow water projects I looked at was that the very best thing to do is to conserve existing intact ecosystems, and the second best thing to do is to restore them to the best of our ability.
Thanks, Erica. These are all great water detective stories. the thing I appreciate about the way you framed the slow water movement is it's taking kind of our triple planetary crisis, as we call it, climate change, pollution, and biodiversity loss, and viewing those issues through a water lens. And just reflecting on what you also highlighted several times is that we need folks and water experts who can have a systems level approach, that not every solution is kind of one size fits all, and we can't have a one directional sort of solution like you just talked about with a lot of carbon credit programs that plant monocultures and whatnot, just to show that natural infrastructure, in air quotes, is happening and can be accounted for. So thank you for giving some updates on additional work that you've been doing. I think it's really fascinating, the work to consider the interplay between healthy and biodiverse forests and our water cycle. I was astounded to hear how much of our rain is, like you were just saying, is impacted by intact forests around us. And the fact that it keeps that water local to the degree that it does was really interesting. So I think we're going to go ahead and transition for just a few minutes to kind of putting this in context in Pennsylvania. I'll share my screen again, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A. I encourage folks to start thinking about questions and adding those to the chat while I'm going through a couple of my slides, and then we're going to open up for a Q&A. And Erica, thank you for showing different editions and iterations of your book. And I see you have two of them in the background where you are.
Yeah.
Which are beautiful. All right, so
I'll stop sharing now.
can everyone see my screen now? I think we're good. Okay. So just a few slow water considerations for Pennsylvania. We talked a little bit about the play.
Jenny, it's
Go
not
ahead,
showing up well. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Abby,
I'm
what do
not
you mean
seeing
by
your
not
slide.
showing up well?
I'm not seeing your slides.
Is that better?
There we go. Okay, thanks.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So we talked a little bit about gray infrastructure, and Erica mentioned that a lot of our systems had a little bit of play. There was still a buffer for which they could continue to function until we started to see increasing impacts of climate change. So here in Pennsylvania, we can thank the American Society of Civic Engineers for every 2 years, I believe, doing an infrastructure rating for states, including Pennsylvania. I just wanted to highlight a couple of the ratings from their 2022 report for Pennsylvania. Related to slow water, we see on the left dams with a C rating of, the rating is A through F, A of course being it's functioning well, F serious issues. Drinking water, we were rated as D. And then on the right here, levees C, stormwater D, and wastewater D minus. So these are critical infrastructure areas where we need to be viewing from a slow water lens. This report actually considers climate resilience in its ratings. And I just wanted to read a little bit of a summary from that report that says, while Pennsylvania's stormwater infrastructure in particular is generally performing adequately for lower intensity events, unfortunately, more intense, frequent, and longer duration storms are beginning to overwhelm aging networks. They estimate that approximately $2 billion in stormwater assets have reached the end of their useful life because a lot of our infrastructure was put in over 50 years ago or even longer, and that a total need exists of $6.7 billion in stormwater funding over the next 3 to 5 years. And if this was published in 2022, that means through 2025 or 2027. And while I mentioned, of course, earlier that the bipartisan infrastructure law and some of the federal investments that we've seen will fill some of that gap, we're a long way from just 6.7 billion for Pennsylvania alone. So that means that a lot of that burden falls on taxpayers to fill gaps at local, state levels and through utility rates. So just wanted to put in perspective, Pennsylvania has serious challenges for upgrading our infrastructure, and there's serious need to consider if nature-based solutions that have more of a systems approach are actually going to be more cost-effective in the end, given where we see ourselves. So I also wanted to reflect on flooding in Pennsylvania. Flooding is the most common natural disaster in Pennsylvania. I don't think that it will come as a surprise to folks on this call. Over the past 50 years, we've seen impacts of climate change in terms of our average annual precipitation in Pennsylvania increasing by about 10%. It's actually higher, about 20% in many places, including the Lake Erie watershed. And over the same period, we've seen that a more than 70% increase in precipitation falling in heavy events. So we're seeing much flashier storms overall and rain events. And worth noting also, the rates of hurricanes and intense storms in Pennsylvania has nearly tripled over the last 2 decades, with a concentration in Southeast PA and the Delaware estuary, of course, with some coastal flooding and inundation there, and some of the Atlantic storms coming across and having significant impacts for Eastern Pennsylvania. When we switch and look at water quality impairment, we know that the Clean Water Act requires that each state assess waterways for their ability to be fishable, drinkable, and swimmable. And unfortunately, in Pennsylvania, we see just over 1/3 of our stream and river miles are impaired for at least one of those 3 conditions. This is a map showing the impaired streams, but also the impaired acreage of lakes in Pennsylvania. You can see all of the Pennsylvania waters of Lake Erie, for example, in the northwest there. So when we think about this, we're really honing in on 3 top issues that are causing impairment in Pennsylvania. Acid mine drainage, agriculture, and urban stormwater runoff are the 3 most common sources of impairment for the waterways that you see in red here. So what that translates to is a lot of nutrient pollution from agriculture, nitrogen and phosphorus tied to things like harmful algal blooms like we see in Lake Erie. And the urban stormwater that we have, primarily we're dealing with sediment and a lot of pollution from sewage, bacterial pollution and pathogens. So we're seeing a situation where water quality is being degraded, which further is tied to less resilience in the face of climate change that exacerbates a lot of the challenges that our waterways face. So, trying to be more hopeful, this is just to show that slow water projects that have a more of a systems approach have a lot of potential to make great strides to improve water quality in Pennsylvania. We also see challenges of urban sprawl and low density development in Pennsylvania. Erica has a lot of discussion in the book about how development and the impacts of impervious surfaces can be reversed through slow water projects and allowing water to once again flow where it needs to and where it has historically. One poignant comment that really struck me in the book, and I believe it was an indigenous water detective that said, your culture goes with your landscape. So when you destroy and you pave over your landscape, the historic relationship that people have built with water, probably over millennia, gets degraded and is lost. That connection is not directly there anymore. And we know that development dramatically changes water's natural cycles. I cited from Penn State here that we know that during a 1-inch rainstorm, every acre of land converted to impervious surface converts 27,000 gallons of water to surface runoff instead of groundwater recharge. And I think sometimes in Pennsylvania, because we have so much surface water, we sometimes fail to remember the connection between surface and groundwater that Erica was talking about in the hyporheic zone. Over 1/3 of Pennsylvanians rely on groundwater as a drinking water source, and over half of that is pumped through private water wells. Pennsylvania also has the 2nd highest number of private water wells after Michigan. And that just strikes me as sometimes we forget all of the people that are relying on groundwater recharge and clean water coming from aquifers and other groundwater sources. So connected to this, of course, is that we in Pennsylvania are converting a lot of the land that is left as green and open space and agriculture in this case to impervious surface. In 2020, the American Farmland Trust found that Pennsylvania ranked 8th of all US states for conversion of agricultural land to low density residential development between 2010 and 2015. In Pennsylvania, it's an all too common scene to see a state route, which is a largely 55-mile-per-hour road dotted with McMansions or large plots of low density residential development. I see that a lot out in Northwest PA, largely rural areas. So anyway, I just wanted to finish with where do we currently stand in terms of natural infrastructure investment in Pennsylvania? And this is just one snapshot that I have referenced a lot in the Great Lakes region. The Resilient Infrastructure Sustainable Communities effort, which is a public-private partnership in the Great Lakes, did a similar assessment to what Erica mentions in the book, in that although green and natural solutions could actually be responsible for up to 37% of the greenhouse gas emissions we need by 2030. Globally, these types of projects only see 3% of climate funding. There's some good news in Pennsylvania. The Clean Water State Revolving Fund is one of the largest funds at the federal level in the US through the EPA that can do stormwater management assistance for local communities. And the good news is that Pennsylvania ranked the highest of all the 8 Great Lakes in terms of the amount of money from that fund that is funneled to Pennsylvania that ultimately makes its way or has made its way into green stormwater infrastructure projects. However, that only amounts for 6% of the funding invested. So it's clear we have a lot more work to do in Pennsylvania for this program. And I can only assume that these results and outcomes would be mirrored in other programs, if not lower, because the federal government has set priorities over time that may be stronger than even what Pennsylvania set for itself. And that includes some of the recent work from the Biden administration. For the first time, we have a climate resilience framework in the US that does have specific priorities and projected outcomes for green solutions. So we're hopeful, of course, that over the next decade or so, we'll see some of the outcomes associated with that federal effort and leadership. But that was just meant to give some context to why it's important to consider slow water solutions in Pennsylvania. We have plenty of work to do as a state and within our local communities to rethink the status quo, to reflect on the scientific understanding of the water experts and detectives around us and compile that knowledge towards solutions that are place-based and make sense in the context from which we operate. So I hope that was helpful. It was quick, but I wanted to put it into context a little bit. So now we're going to shift over to Q&A. And I want to make sure that as a reminder, folks know that you can raise your hand or put a question in the chat. And I see that there are some notes in the chat that I'm going to go to now. I can scroll up here. So I've got a question I see from Emily about what do people do to restore an urban stream? Erica, this is a pretty broad question. I can let you take it from here, and then I can speak a little bit to the Pennsylvania context too. Erica, you're muted.
Thank you. Sorry. Yeah, I touched on it a little bit with the flagship project in Seattle. Before that project, a lot of urban stream restoration would seek to take out some of the hard armoring and like sort of re-meander part of it and maybe put some native plants or some rocks or logs, kind of make it look habitat-y. But what was done better in the Seattle project is, first of all, they used historical ecology. And so, it was like an 11-mile long stream. In the projects, there were 2 projects totaling 1,600 feet, which is tiny. But because they did the projects in historical floodplains, they had an outsized impact on reducing flooding because the water wants to slow there. Similarly, there's this idea of, if you build it, they will come. If you make it look more like natural habitat, the critters will just return. But what one of my sources told me is, when your headwaters are a Home Depot parking lot, they're not coming. And so that's why they felt like they needed to reintroduce these critters from a wilder stream. So I think there's also sediment management, which can be a really big deal in urban streams. A lot of cities have to dredge their streams that remain on the surface regularly because when you have a rainstorm and all that rain runs off suddenly off of the pavement, it's picking up really fine dust and particles, and that kind of gums up the creek. But what Seattle found was that this area, they used to have to dredge once a year at the cost of about $1 million each time. And now they only have to dredge like once every 5 years. And it's because the stream is redistributing its own sediment. The sediment is still ultimately going down toward the lake, but it's reshaping the floodplains and it's reshaping the meanders. And so if you have a healthy system, if you're able to create that, it can maintain itself to a larger degree.
Yeah, Erica, thanks for giving that example. And just as a reminder, the question that was put in the chat was, what do people do to restore an urban stream? So what does that process look like? And Erica has just given us I would say, one of the premier best practices. I think one of the things on my list to do research on is has this translated to Pennsylvania at all? Has not necessarily an implementation project, but where is a similar discussion about hyperrheic restoration and the reintroduction of the microbiome of a stream taking place in Pennsylvania, if anywhere? Erica, I don't know if you have any colleagues or allies here that have talked about that.
Yeah, I don't know if it's happening in Pennsylvania. I do know that it's become a standard practice in Seattle since this project. They don't do it every time, but they consider doing it for every stream project. And it's definitely been used elsewhere in Washington state. And they've been getting a ton of interest from around the country and around the world. So a lot of people are asking them about their experience, and the science that they've done is ongoing. They're continuing to study this particular restoration and how it's performing over time in different ways, and also some of the newer projects they're doing. So that body of knowledge that can inform other projects is growing.
Great, thank you. And I just wanted to reflect on in Pennsylvania, the types of water detectives we often see collaborating on stream restoration projects. We often see municipal staff and elected officials playing a bigger and bigger role in this work. Land trusts play a big role in other nonprofit conservation-based groups, academic institutions also. And you saw some of those water detectives come together in the Seattle example. So just wanted to bring it back to Pennsylvania and kind of have folks get an understanding of what team might be assembled to help. Second question that I'm seeing in the chat is, what happens to toxins removed from street water after they build up in curbside water gardens? Has anyone planned on toxin removal after years of buildup?
I think it definitely depends. In some cases, the soils and the microbes can break that down. And so and that's one of the studies that they're doing in the Seattle project, is like the pollutants that were reduced, it happened just over a matter of hours. So they don't think that they broke down. They think that they stuck to biofilms that kind of coat the rocks and the soils, but they anticipate that microbes will be breaking them down over time. So that's one of the things that they're studying going forward. But I do know that there are some, like there was one project I looked at in China where the river was really, really polluted, and they had introduced some kind of riverside wetlands, restored that to help clean the water. And it was doing so, but in that case, there were some heavy metals that weren't going to be broken down. And so they were going to be cutting the plants periodically and basically putting them in a heavy metals waste facility. So yeah, it definitely depends on what you have there, and how healthy your system is and how complete your system is to help break that stuff down, and also what pollutants you're talking about.
Yeah, good question. And I think, and then I am no expert in this field, but I think it's really interesting how many plants naturally bioaccumulate a lot of toxins. And then of course, it's still the question of what do you do with that material afterward. But I know that there are dozens of plants that are studied for brownfield site reclamation in particular. Another interesting area of science there. But next question that I see is related to residential lawns. Relatively, how much potential to improve water systems does converting lawns with little or no foot traffic to native trees and other plants?
Yes, please do that. You know, irrigated, so lawns are the largest irrigated crop in North America. And in the United States, they consume 9 billion gallons of water a day. And the vast majority of residential water goes to outdoor watering and landscaping. And, in some places, like in the Southwest, that can be 70 or 80% of people's water usage. And so there's a massive ability to conserve water. And in some places in the West, they're starting to require that. I mean, you can still have your lawn if you're playing soccer or if you have kids in your backyard. But yes, if it's just an ornamental thing surrounding a business campus or whatever, then you have to get rid of it. The other thing is that, lawns have a huge pesticide and fertilizer toll, and a lot of that just runs right off into the watersheds. There's a lot of fossil fuels used in mowing lawns, and it's really an ecological desert. And I think one thing is like, why do we have lawns? And really, they're a monument to English aristocratic estates. They're not about our own place. And I think I have seen that culture shift really quickly. Like Phoenix is a good example. Within about 20 years, lawns have really fallen out of favor. And now people have an attitude of, we moved to the desert because we love the desert, and they take a real pride of place in their saguaro cactuses and in their palo verde trees. And so I think, that kind of connection to place, like learning what plants are native to your area, helping to support local butterflies and birds and other animals right within your yard, can be, I found it to be such a source of joy, and really a very, very hugely positive step from a water perspective, both for usage and pollutants. I don't water my yard ever, because it's adapted to the water that comes, nor do I use any chemical fertilizers or pesticides.
Yeah, thank you, Erica, for reflecting on the science of that and your own lived experience in your yard. I have my husband to thank for helping me get into gardening as a person who did not grow up necessarily with that exposure. And I've got 60 something species of plants in my small 0.2 acres of land at this point, and it's been amazing to see return of a lot of insect species and the birds in our backyard. And it's just been such a stress relief and a hobby and a passion that I've developed. And I do want to plug that Dr. Doug Ptolemy, I am a fellow graduate of Allegheny College alongside him, and he has a movement in Pennsylvania that has now gone nationwide for homegrown national parks and really emphasizing the impact of alternative landscaping and conversion of lawns to pollinator plants, and all of the myriad benefits that come from that. And I did just want to acknowledge that Ed Wren, who put that question in the chat, is affiliated with Wild Ones and is already an expert on this topic, but I'm glad that he raised it. And he had put some additional information in the chat about how to access the work that they do in Pennsylvania too. So I'm going to pivot to a couple questions that I had, or we'll do at least one while we're on. I would be remiss if I didn't talk about politics a little bit, but I want to acknowledge that Erica, in the book, you made it very clear from the beginning that politics and agriculture were two topics that you could write books about many times over. They weren't going to be the primary focus of this work. But as a staff person of a legal and policy based advocacy group, I really wanted to make sure we talked about it. So are there any success stories of slow water policies that you wanted to reflect on? And similarly, on the other side of that, are there challenges associated with getting those policies implemented that we should be sure we discuss?
Yeah, I'll just share my screen again if that's all right. Continue. All right. So yeah, one project that really impressed me was set in Peru. And Peru has a major water scarcity problem. About 2/3 of its population lives on the arid desert plain, just downslope from the Andes. And they have typically relied on glaciers to get them through the dry season, and the glaciers are melting and the population is booming. And so the capital city of Lima already only is able to deliver water like 20 hours a day. And there are poor people in the city who don't have water at all. So they're very, very concerned with water scarcity. And as a result, the country passed a series of national laws that require water utilities to invest in nature. So a certain percentage of everybody's water bill across the country must be invested upstream in the watershed. So before it was considered corruption if you would do something like that, and now it's required. And so some of the projects they're looking at, they call it natural infrastructure for water security. And what I really like about this is because it's national, it shows like the scale that could be achieved for slow water projects. And so this picture is of a high altitude wetland called Bofedales or cushion bog. And it's rare, but very, very important. And even without glaciers, it holds a lot of water, sort of like a beaver pond. And there are traditional practices for expanding the footprint of the Bofedales. On the right, you can see what happens when people steal the peat for the nursery trade. Please do not use peat in your gardening. It does a very, very important role in its place. Peatlands cover just 3% of the global land area, but they store 10% of all fresh water and 30% of the world's soil carbon. And when people cut out squares like this, you can see like the peat all around is drying. Like it needs all of those plants next to each other to survive. So some of the money from the water utilities is being invested in protecting these peatlands from peat thievery and also restoring them. Another super cool thing they're investing in is, if you can see this little kind of snaky thing across the slope of the hill, it's called an amuna, and it's a 1,400-year-old innovation by the Wari people. And basically, like California, they have a long dry season in the high Andes. So during the wet season, they would route excess water from the stream through this canal to a natural infiltration basin, you know, kind of a bowl in the mountain that was very porous. And the water would move underground, and then it would emerge further down the mountain from a spring later into the dry season. So because the water moves much more slowly underground than on the surface, they were able to extend the water availability into the dry season and continue their farming. And so a few villages still practice this communal practice of maintaining these systems and sharing the water. But a lot of villages, it had fallen into disuse. And so again, the utilities are investing in repairing the system, because the farmers can still use it. But then, you know, it goes underground again and makes its way down underground again to the rivers that ultimately supply Lima and the other people in the urban areas. And so the same practice that can extend the water supply into the dry season for the farmers also does the same for the urban areas. So anyway, I could go on about that, but it's a very cool national project. And, you know, implementing it did have some hurdles. They had some help from Forest Trends, which is a US-based NGO, to kind of help scale it up. At the time that I visited in 2019, I talked to one water utility that served Cusco, and the guy who was managing was like, well, we don't have to use that money for these types of projects. And he did, but you know, it was new to him, and I think he was hoping he could just use it for a traditional infrastructure thing. So that's one example of how, you know, there's a big education component to even getting your decision makers to understand what's expected of them with this type of law.
Yeah, thanks, Erica, for giving that example. I think it's definitely true that just doing the baseline education for some of these principles is step one for some slow water projects. And I think the example that you gave is a good kind of reflection in some of the stories you give. It's a top-down kind of national approach, like we saw with sponge cities in China, where the different levels of, or different systems of government a country has or locality has dictate the possibilities for the slow water movement. And in the US, we mentioned earlier, we're going to have a mosaic of local projects that have watershed scale impacts in most cases. We have some federal leadership we're seeing at the moment, but it's really with a lot of local land use decision making happening at the municipal and county level. That's where a lot of the projects are going to happen. And it means that local people have a big influence if they're engaged in a lot of this work, and helping to tie water detectives to elected officials, be a bridge. That's a lot of the times the situation that PennFuture finds itself in. We're kind of a translator back and forth between different groups and translating information up to elected officials. And a lot of you on this call help us do that really important work. So Erica, thanks for reflecting on that experience. I think I'm gonna just do one more question before we close out and I give some announcements and information about upcoming events. I wanted to touch again on the relationship of like pre-colonial and traditional ecological knowledge and the knowledge coming from indigenous communities and how that can be blended with the modern scientific understanding that we have to do slow water projects. In Pennsylvania, we are largely separated from a lot of that history, and the indigenous communities that we have don't have the same recognition and status as in some countries and other states. So I wondered if you had any advice for water detectives and water advocates in Pennsylvania about repairing some of that lost relationship and gaining back some of that lost knowledge.
Yeah, it's a good question. I live part of the year in British Columbia, which doesn't have any better record with its indigenous peoples than the United States. However, a lot of the bands there never signed treaties because settlers got to that area after the treaty era. And so a lot of their land was unceded, but taken by the colonial government. And so there's been a process of through court cases over decades of trying to grant indigenous peoples their land rights again, and potentially water rights as well. And what that means in terms of management and basically what it means is the colonial government relinquishing some power. But so there's a lot of lip service about that, but not a lot of maybe meaningful change. But I've also done a fair bit of reporting on kind of the intersection between Western science and traditional ecological knowledge. And Western science, by its nature, is reductionist, right? I mean, you're usually trying to reduce all of the variables so you can solve for that one question and get a one specific answer. And indigenous knowledge tends to be much more systems oriented. So one example in the Northwest, like instead of grouping the mammals and the reptiles and the birds, they group in families of, the mammal that eats this other mammal that eats this insect, and they're all in a relationship with each other. And so that kind of mindset, I think, can be really useful. And just Western scientists respecting indigenous knowledge, because a lot of times they'll say, well, that's not proven, or that's a story, or and I interviewed a Hopi farmer named Michael Johnson for a story, and he told me, 3,000 years of replication is a science. So I think respect and open-mindedness can go a long way, and giving indigenous people a really meaningful seat at the table, like where their knowledge is valued and sought after, would be a significant change and could help a lot.
Yeah, thanks, Erica. And I just did want to highlight that not too far from us in Syracuse, New York, Robin Wall Kimmerer, who's another author who's been a great voice in connecting what we call Western science and traditional ecological knowledge at the SUNY Environmental Science and Forestry School. She has, I apologize, I'm not remembering the exact name of her center, but she has basically a center for indigenous knowledge within the environmental science school there that's really trying to get at this intersection and help prepare modern water detectives for that intersectional work. So something for us all to think about in the advocacy that we do and creating meaningful space and representation and creating opportunities for that sort of connection. So I think with that, we're going to transition to closing. I thought one more question in the chat. Maybe it's not there anymore, but I hope I didn't miss anybody's questions. I'm going to share my screen one last time. And I just wanted to make sure to plug one more time that our partners, there we go. Our partners at Pressed still have copies of Water Always Wins for sale, and you can go to their online website if you're not from the Erie region and support them through bookshop.org. 15% of sales will benefit PennFuture. I also wanted to chat about one space that PennFuture is operating in that is trying to promote slow water in some cases and from some angles at the local level. We talked about how land use is very much locally driven in Pennsylvania, and we have one of our experts, Bridget Meyer, who is a land use expert and municipal law expert. She's in our Pocono office as a staff attorney. She's going to join us just briefly to share a project that we have released on Earth Day this past week that she led. And Bridget, I assume you are on. I saw you earlier, so I didn't mean to speak without double checking, but did you just want to give a little bit of information about public participation, public power, community guide to land use decision making in Pennsylvania?
Yes, I can do that. Let me get my video going on. Sorry, I'm moving locations, so all the activity going on behind me in the household is not disturbing everybody. Yes, this is a guidebook that we released last week. It does all of those things that are on the screen. This is something that we thought was needed as land use decision making in Pennsylvania is very much a local game. A lot of these things happen on like in your township or borough or city, and it can be confusing. There are multiple decision-making bodies, multiple types of decisions that can be made, and understanding how it all works is incredibly key to being effective in participating in shaping how land use works in your community. So I know we're running a little late here, so I won't go into a lot of detail, but we encourage you to check that out. It's on our website, and you can scan that Swell QR code there too.
And I just want to mention that Abby, who's also a part of PennFuture's team, put a link in that is the same as what's connected via the QR code. So thanks, Bridget, for heading up this effort and giving folks the tools and the empowerment to engage in the local land use decision-making processes. Hopefully we'll have folks who are raising questions about slow water and the slow water movement as part of those efforts. And then the other thing, we talked about how this is part of a series. Wanted to share some of the information from Erie. We also have a QR code on our website if you want to learn more about the events that'll be happening between now and late August. A lot of you are not from the Lake Erie watershed, but if you find yourself as one of the 4 million plus folks who head up to Presque Isle State Park in the summertime, you may have an opportunity to join us for some of the in-person events. Otherwise, we reconvene in late August for a stormwater policy briefing, focused at the local and state level, which will help us again reflect on the slow water movement as we go through the series and conclude in late August virtually. So thanks to folks who can participate from here on out. And with that, I just wanted to say thank you and share my contact information if there are additional questions. Importantly, I think right now we want to make sure that we do a virtual thank you and hand clap for Erica for joining us tonight. You can do that via the reactions or on camera here. I really appreciate her joining us, tuning in and sharing her expertise and a lot of the great clean water or slow water movement best practices that she highlighted in the book. I definitely have some new items on my travel bucket list. I'd love to connect and see some of these examples in my travels moving forward. And Erica, if there's anything else that you want to say before we officially close, I can give you the floor back.
Okay, thank you so much for inviting me. This has been fun. And I think, the biggest takeaway I took from meeting the water detectives is that, climate change, biodiversity loss, water issues, these problems can feel really overwhelming and like we're waiting for international decision makers to do something. But the water detectives I met have had a really empowering experience of coming together with people in their own communities to do something locally to make their local communities more resilient from a flooding, drought, and climate perspective. And so I hope that's the bottom line that I hope people can take away, is that you know, we have the power to do something in our own communities, and I think that's really exciting.
I think that's a perfect way to close. Erica has given us all a charge that we either support existing water detectives, or if we're burgeoning ones ourselves, hone our skills and impact our local decision making and encourage others to take components from the slow water movement and make them applicable to our local communities. So with that, I want to thank you all too for tuning in tonight, being participants in this conversation, and hopefully taking some of these stories and reflecting on what they might mean for you and your community. I encourage you to take a look at some of the resources on our website that we referenced, and I will share the recording and any other information related in the next week or so. So thank you again. Hope you all enjoy the rest of your evening. Nice to meet a lot of you for the first time.
Thank you. Bye.